Hello, everyone. Welcome to Anti-Racist Education Through Local Digital History, a virtual roundtable. I just would like to remind everyone to please turn your cameras and microphones off because this will be recorded, and doing so will ensure also that everyone will see the panelists. My name is Rachel Donaldson. I'm the public historian here in the History Department at the College of Charleston, and I would like to thank the History Department for funding this roundtable and also give a special thanks to Andrea Evans for designing our flyer and promoting the event. So I'm going to begin now by introducing all of our panelists. Elisa J. Jones is our moderator and co-organizer. She is a historian of early modern France and comparative history of rights. She has training in virtual programming, digital pedagogy, digital history, public exhibitions, libraries, and archives through a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library, coursework in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and experience working in libraries and archives. Mary Battle is one of our panelists. She is a senior content developer, interpretive planner, and scholarly researcher at the museum planning and design firm Ralph Applebaum Associates. Her areas of professional expertise include exhibition development, project planning, and scholarly research and review. Battle's projects at Ralph Applebaum Associates include supporting content development for the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. Aisha Hakel is the manager of archival services at the College of Charleston's Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. She is responsible for collection development, public programming, instruction, reference, and administrative duties. Her research interests include African American history, digital preservation, censorship, and community archiving. Marina Lopez joined the Citadel Oral History Program as the Assistant Director and Community Archivist in 2015. For the past 10 years, her work has focused on documenting the Latinx communities of the Lowcountry. This work resulted in the creation of Las Voces of the Lowcountry, an oral history project, Aquí Estamos, a bilingual digital archive, and Ecos Arte Urgente, a traveling multimedia art exhibit. And Leah Worthington is the Digital Projects Librarian at the College of Charleston. She is co-director of the Lowcountry Digital History Initiative, a digital public history project whose mission focuses on the region's underrepresented history. She is also the associate director of the Lowcountry Digital Library, a digital repository for the materials of over 20 regional archives, museums, and libraries. Thank you, and I'm going to hand it over now to Elisa Jones, our moderator.
Thank you, Rachel. And a special thank you to our panelists today for agreeing to have this conversation. The idea for this program came directly out of our current pandemic situation. It is almost an understatement to say that 2020 has been a challenging year, but it has been especially difficult for public history practitioners and other archive, library, museum, and heritage institution professionals whose work depends on interacting with the public. In my own position as a postdoctoral fellow at the Newberry Library in Chicago last spring, I joined my colleagues in a complete reorientation of our programming as we learned how to reach our audiences in new formats and designed entirely new programs as a part of our response. Despite the impediments COVID-19 places on public interaction, for practitioners committed to anti-racist approaches to their institution's mission, the unrest and protests in response to anti-Black violence and controversial historical monuments has increased the urgency and clarified the need for this work. The idea behind this roundtable was to bring together professionals with experience in different elements of public history work in Charleston in order to provide immediate guidance for others interested in doing this work under these circumstances, and also to start a longer conversation about the long-term planning, commitments, and community-based partnerships that can make it both sustainable and meaningful over time. We also recognize the risks that institutions take in doing this work. We have put safeguards in place for this very session out of concerns for the possibility of disruptions by those with harmful intentions. We are in a time where being anti-racist has become equated with choosing a position as though its opposite is an equally viable choice. This is both a challenge to this work and a reason for moving forward with it. And I thank you all for joining us today as we try to learn more about how we can approach it in Charleston during the pandemic and, I hope, beyond it. So I would like to start our discussion with our panelists by asking them if they would be able to discuss the meaning of anti-racist approaches to their work and their own particular experiences, and in their positions in Charleston or in local history, and how it relates to both their work and their profession. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all being here, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Rachel and Alicia, for organizing this panel and bringing us all together on this Thursday. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Aisha Heichel. I'm at Archival Services at College of Charleston's Avery Research Center for African History and Culture. And I want to just talk about from my experiences as an archivist. And so those who may not know where we're located in our mission at Avery, we are located at 125 Bull Street, about 5 short blocks from the college main center of campus. And our mission is to document, preserve, and collect and promote Black history in Lowcountry in South Carolina Lowcountry and the African diaspora. And I just want to share with you all today that the anti-racist approaches in archives and at the College of Charleston's Avery, we, at our core, it's about preserving Black stories. And so we want to make sure that Black stories, Black experiences, Black lives are, cared for, shared appropriately with the public. And so in doing that, we start from the beginning, working with our donors, making sure that we collect and reach out to people who come from the wide variety of experiences, from the quote unquote elite down to ordinary people, because that is what Black people are. We all come in different shapes and sizes, but not monolithic. And part of anti-racism is experiencing and honoring the wide variety of experiences that we have in this country. It also comes with our description practices in archives and libraries. And so from that means, how do we organize the materials? How do we, how the kind of finding aids are created? What kind of words are we using that are inclusive and diverse and are representative of the current time? And so what's happening now in archives and library, and I'll talk about more later, is kind of redoing and revamping some description practices that are outdated. And that is because historically archives have been historically marginalized communities have not always had people from that community to describe those materials. And so part of that anti-racist description about who is in the archive, who is working with collections. I also want to include that our policies and procedures is also part anti-racism part of our practices. And so there's analysis happening right now in terms of police in archives and libraries, amount of security and surveillance that we have in the reading room. What kind of IDs are we requiring to use materials? And then also include our reference and instruction services. And in those interactions with patrons and with students, we talk about who's missing, who's in the gaps, who's collected, who's not collected, and then where do you find these stories and how to interrogate stories and collections that are maybe come from the predominant communities. And I look forward to exploring more and with this conversation and let my other panelists go ahead. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to go. I'm just saying what's okay. Sorry, I have to figure out who's muting or unmuting. So I'm Mary Battle. This is a real honor to be here. Thank you for arranging, Rachel and Elisa, and also super fun to see my former coworkers. So Aisha and I worked together at the Avery Research Center. And I also worked with Leah Worthington on the Lowcountry Digital History Initiative. So this is also a fun reunion. And I hope all the folks out there in Charleston are doing well. So since 2017, I've been working with Ralph Applebaum Associates, which is a museum planning design firm, as we discussed. And we're kind of I didn't really know much about this world until I got into it, but we're often sort of behind the scenes working with helping different museum projects get going. And so A big project I've been a part of is the International African American Museum in Charleston. But my firm is also working on projects all over the country and actually all over the world. So I'm also working on Japanese American National Museum in LA, Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith House in Lancaster is a new project we're just starting. Let's see, a Museum of Civil Rights project we're working on with Reverend Al Sharpton. So it's really the uniting theme around a lot of these projects actually recently is really connected to promoting anti-racist understandings of history, anti-racist narratives, and promoting public awareness often of underrepresented histories. And so, you know, it's a constant part of our work about how do we develop projects and work with clients to consider ways to be proactive. I think of anti-racist work as being, how do you be proactive about centering marginalized groups and centering underrepresented voices and people of color and women and LGBTQIA experiences. So yeah, there's all kinds of ways to do it because there's all kinds of clients and all kinds of projects out there. But I think at the core of our work, we're always trying to, you know, work with teams, that we reach out for help, we build networks. And so we often have our museums, they do not work, you know, just in-house. They have to work with teams of scholars, teams of community stakeholders, teams of advisors to get different voices at the table and to really be proactive about how can we develop an inclusive institution. And that translates to planning the project, planning collections, planning staff, planning budgets, but also planning what happens when the museum opens, you know, the different objects in there, but also the media and the website and the outreach. So it's kind of all the things. And in all of this, you know, promoting more inclusive public history has been at the heart of, you know, a lot of the projects that I've been a part of. So it's exciting to be here.
Hey, I am Marina Lopez. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Rachel and Lisa, for organizing this. And I am so glad to jump after Mary, because she is presenting this global approach to our conversation. And I am going to anchor my thoughts in a very local practice. So, and I'd love to, you know, to put our minds together around that. I work at the Charleston Oral History Program at the Citadel, and the mission of the Oral History Program is to document the stories of the local residents of the Lowcountry. And the other two things that we do other than documenting is to promote best practices in oral history through local workshops and being helpful to researchers in the college and outside the college in the community. And the third thing that we take very seriously is to have conversations with the community about the stories that we collect as a way to promote dialogue and hopefully to help to be more democratic in our area. So, but I am going to be talking particularly about the project that I have been working in for almost 10 years now, but very intensely in the past 3 years. That is a program that is focused on the Latinx communities in Charleston. And that project includes an oral history collection, includes, after that, we branch out with a community archival project, and we have an art traveling exhibit. And then in collaboration with the Lowcountry Digital Library, we have also an exhibit and a chronology. So really our way to enter, I think about that, that we can frame the project like an anti-racist project that was born in a very particular political moment in our country and in South Carolina. Most of you know already that the Latino community has been growing a lot in the last 30 years. And with that have grown also the anxieties and around the the immigrants and all the politics that we have around immigrants as a scapegoat, really. So we started this as a, as a response to a political moment, and that sense of urgency never stopped. So, so in that sense, you can think on the project like an anti-racist, but I like to think that more like an affirming project. We were not part, and I am talking as a halfie, right? Like a person that study and is part of the community. We were not part of the historical record in Charleston. We were not part of the historical record in South Carolina. So I like to think about this project like as an affirming project, not only like anti-racist, but in favor of a community that has not been sufficiently documented before, that has not been considered in our public organizations enough. So I see the project like an affirmation of our humanity, affirmation of our collaboration and contributions to the culture and the economy of the region. And so that is what I have to start. So it's your turn, Leah.
Thank you, Marina. Hello, everyone. I'm Leah Worthington. I am the Associate Director of the Lowcountry Digital Library, which is more on the archives side. But I'm going to stick to talking. I'm going to let Marina and Aisha lead the archives conversation and talk more about the Lowcountry Digital History Initiative side, which is publishes digital exhibits about the Lowcountry, but specifically focuses on underrepresented narratives. And I liked what Marina was saying about affirmations of community. I think if I were to think about that in a Lowcountry digital history context for the Lowcountry, it's an affirmation of historical realities. As opposed to sort of mythologies that can kind of sneak in and take the place of history. But, as someone who started out in history and kind of moved into public history, there's just a huge difference between what scholars are writing about and have accepted and what the public is talking about and understands as their idea of what a history of a space and people are. And with the Lowcountry, this was an established project, and I worked with Mary because she was just like she's planning now for all kinds of other museums and projects. She founded with John White, Dean of the Libraries, and other folks, part of the LCDL team, to create a space where the Lowcountry's history could be told from the perspective of underrepresented people who, for the majority and most of the Lowcountry's history, that is a Black majority. So in addition to focusing on Black history as a topic, and this is something I work with grad students on and with partnering authors on, is also to talk about not just Black history as a topic, but focusing and centering Black historical actors and Black perspectives. And as Aisha was saying, there's a whole breadth of experiences there. So this is a really rich environment to be able to talk about all of those different experiences that people had from colonial and antebellum history into kind of a post Civil War situation, where you have also rural and urban experiences, and sort of taking all of these archival elements that are out there at the Avery and all across different archival locations in South Carolina, and being able to kind of bring those stories to life. In terms of anti-racist approaches in the Lowcountry, if you're telling the history as it happened, a lot of the work has been done for you, because there's and it's what I find is that it's difficult for some people who have an idea of what the Lowcountry's history is to kind of come to terms with some of what, what is kind of termed difficult history. So there's an emotional element you're dealing with when you're dealing with the public and trying to talk to them about what's happened in history. But we've had a lot of success with also reaching out via social media and getting people to understand that the Lowcountry digital history is there, but then there's also kind of these smaller chunks of history, and we have a wide range of followers there. But again, even our social media is mission centered. So how do you tell a history? If you've defaulted to a perspective that a narrative has often been told in, it's one of the things I do is constantly say, okay, that's a story we know about the Lowcountry, but how do we center a different voice, an underrepresented voice? So I will leave it there for now.
Thank you all so much for beginning this conversation with all of your different perspectives. And I think it's wonderful that we have people who work on different stages of different projects and approaches to working with the public. And I'm wondering if we can address the idea of project development, which I think is something a lot of people are concerned about or worried about, or in the midst of, and the idea of how you plan long-term for an anti-racist approach in your organization versus, or maybe including, the pressure people feel to deal with both responding to current crises now and maybe putting things forward more immediately, but also the sort of pressure to do so digitally, right? And what that looks like and how that can be dealt with. There's one thing to say that I'm planning something and I would like it to take place sooner. And it's another thing to say, I was planning this to be in person and now I have to plan it to be sooner and online. How do you make something sustainable? How do you address all of the different questions you would normally, in addition to that sort of presentation? So I'm wondering if, based on your own experiences at different levels of doing that, you would mind sharing with us some thoughts you might have.
I mean, I guess I can speak to, try to speak to certain aspects of the question. I mean, I think as far as, project planning and what it's meant to do that now, I mean, of course, it's been incredibly challenging, right? I mean, that there's no getting around the fact that it's incredibly challenging. A lot of institutions are really dealing with budget crises, staffing crises, worried about the health and safety of their employees. All of these things are quite real. And so I think we all have had to adjust and sort of do what we can. And, I think we were talking about this in the planning session. Sometimes it's just challenging. I will say some things that just working with our different clients that we have noticed during this time for institutions that have the means, that this time does actually allow space for planning, and so we've actually been able to not just work with our clients virtually and it actually working out okay, as much as we all get eye strain and sick of looking at Zoom, it does, you are able to have conversations and have some real work happen in terms of planning, behind the scenes, how to get ready. So a lot of work, I think, particularly when you're trying to be inclusive, when you're trying to work on like anti-racist project, it takes resource and it also takes help. So building networks and getting that input, we've been able to have meetings that we used to have in person and probably half the people show up in person that ended up or would have shown up, I guess, if we'd still done it. Whereas virtually, when you're asking these scholars to help you out or these different folks to show up and give input into your planning process, both within your institution and outside, advisors, suddenly they show up because everyone's stuck at home and they're ready for something to do. So I think as far as the time for folks who are working at different institutions, if this is a moment for you to start considering your resources and considering your time and projects you want to plan for when that beautiful reopening comes, or as the world opens up. I think this time has been valuable in some weird ways, but it doesn't replace the challenges, obviously, but it does open up a window. I think the other thing we have found with some of our clients is also that a lot of funding resources that were simultaneously with COVID also dealing, with the surge of activism for supporting Black Lives Matter and supporting anti-racist work. And a lot of funding sources are also noting that and are prioritizing projects and helping institutions that are prioritizing that. So it's not just the right thing to do, it's actually where a lot of the foundations and funding sources for cultural heritage are going. So we've also been helping clients deal with some of their fundraising needs and how to position themselves to be ready to approach institutions for resources and also to implement it, not just to lip service it, but actually do it. So I think those are sort of some of the things we're helping to plan for during this strange time.
I wanna kind of echo what Mary is saying is about planning with communities. Is that communities who may not necessarily normally have audiences of diverse communities or Black communities, whatever race community I'm trying to work with, is that there's time to reach out and to be in spaces with them and to let them have, do listening sessions with them. But I also want to encourage all of us to recognize that you have to go in it with the good intentions, but also the intentionality and purpose of a long sustaining partnership or relationship with these communities, because you don't want to jump in and plan for an activity that just quote unquote a trend, right? And so these communities are not trends. They're here, they're historical, they are important. And so thinking about that and what's the real goal, and making sure that these projects that you are working with communities are mutually beneficial, that you're not coming at it as the large institution saving, quote unquote, these other communities, right? Because they are there, they have their own ways of preserving records, preserving histories, maybe oral traditions, maybe some textiles or dance traditions that you are not necessarily familiar with, right? And so it's a time for you to take a step back from your own biases and your perceived notion of what is quote unquote archival, what's a record, and also understanding and respecting the need of communities not to be preserved and a right to be forgotten. But that's also part of anti-racist approaches, is respecting communities' perspectives and not imposing your own views onto other people. Thank you.
I think for us, we have the advantage that we are our materials are born digital. So somehow we were protected by that, because all the, the oral histories and the digital archive and the art exhibit, all of that is available online. So we could adjust to keep sharing those with our friends online. Obviously, it's not the same. And it was absolutely frustrating to be working for many months to have these in-person activities, working with teachers, working with other organizations, and then from one day to the next, you had to bring everything down. It has been more than frustrating, but I think everything that we have done grew up from our relationships in the community, our limitations and our reach with those relationships in the community. And I think that we have to take this time on those relationships too, like we take it on family, that we have to keep building on those relationships in this time that is hard for us and it's hard for everybody. And I have to go with Mary and with Aisha that it's time for planning. I don't think that, we want to rush, but there is not too much to rush about. We don't know where we are going, and this is a global crisis. So as much as we want to have, all the answers, we don't have the answers. And I have to, I think that we have to fight the temptation to run and to collect more and to do more things. And maybe it's time for planning, to listening, to see what we have in our collections, what are the holes that we have there, the relationships that we need to keep fostering. And so that could be my my thing. We have some good programs with middle schools, and a jail is using the art exhibit in an art program, so things that we never thought about before. But on that way, we have learned also about the limitations that our communities have. So we are having all these problems, but I think that we really need to think too, what are the limitations that our intent audiences are having, and how we collaborate with our audiences instead of becoming an extra burden for them. So that could be my thing.
I will, I think just in thinking about the different parts of this question, so there's this kind of current crisis now, right? Both in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of how much increase in activism we saw in the spring and summer of 2020. And so not as a crisis, but just as sort of events going on that are impacting the kind of conversations people are having. And for LDHI, for the digital library, I could not immediately write or get someone to write or just make appear an exhibit. Like, that was not possible for me. But what I could do was use social media to connect the narratives I understand about the Lowcountry to the narratives of the present. So I think in terms of that inclination to move immediately or to act immediately, there's a way to do that isn't biting off more than you can chew. So I took a few days, and it was the summer, so I didn't have any graduate assistants working with me at the time, but I just took a few days and looked at the history of political violence and activism and uprisings in the Lowcountry. I turned that into a really quick timeline on social media, and we got a really good response from it. But it was a manageable kind of project, and that will potentially become an exhibit. But it gave people accurate information to work with immediately. And I think you can do that with your space or with your objects. There's always a way to connect. If you want to do that immediate response thing, there's a way to connect what you already have to whatever is going on. And I think that helps a lot with Aisha, I think, brought up intentionality, right? Not kind of, this as a planning phase for a lot of different things is really useful, because a lot of really, good work takes good planning. So I was able to kind of bite that small project off and then plan a bigger project as a result of that, which then goes back to including graduate students and lots of research. And I have the time to do that now. But I think too, the challenge of training folks online is tough but doable, and just accepting that it's going to be slower, and communicating with my various partnering authors that things that took me 15 minutes in the office are now taking 3 hours at home, and I can't really explain perfectly why. But, just sort of allowing the slower pace has been challenging, but communicating with people that it is going to be slower, and realizing that I don't quite have the capacity to get projects off the ground as quick, but it's happening. So maybe it's just an acceptance of pace, like Marina was saying.
I did also just want to quickly add to the other thing that has been a sort of weird, again, I don't want to say like benefit, but silver lining, however, the bittersweet positives have been the amazing amount of uh, online resources that have been out there that different museums and institutions have been putting out there in terms of professional training type work, or just, I know like the Southeastern Museum Conference will do these happy hours or these presentations, you know, and you sort of will have these gatherings that I, you know, otherwise would have been an in-person talk that I'm not in, you know, X city to attend. And so I know a really cool one that I went to was about, you know, museums ultimately are community organizations. They're located in a place. And it was ways that museums could both deal with their own struggles and their own missions, but also try to contribute, you know, in the communities where they are. So there was, I think it was like the New Orleans Museum of Art that made, you know, they were doing digital programs, obviously, to keep engaging their audiences, but also making handout print programs for kids to go with food banks. With the bags they were handing out, because a lot of people had challenges with the digital divide and being able to access resource. So they were sort of giving them arts activities to do with the food bank resources. Or, you know, another partner we've been talking to have been archivists that are working on collecting materials connected to protests and sort of advising our clients on how they could engage this type of collecting the now, you know, type work. And a lot of the discussion is not just to be extractive and how to, you know, go and get stuff, but also how to give back in that process. So how they could partner with medical workers or partner with different resources to bring to protests or people that are struggling, while they're also doing their work of reaching out and being a cultural heritage, you know, curator or collector or archivist or however they're working. So there's a lot of ingenuity, I think, going on in this challenging time in the cultural heritage profession, both digitally and in person, or, you know, physical things you can contribute that I think are amazing, and a load of webinars out there to watch if you want.
And I have to second that, Mary, that the level of communication and collaboration that had happened in this past month in the profession has been great. And what I have seen is just not, you know, in our country, but, you know, that is just a global collaboration too, with all the things that happen in the world, not only, you know, not only on US, but everything that is happening in Latin America in the past year. And we have been able to see archivists and historians working together and getting together in conversations about how to document and how to go and how to support, you know, education and how to support democracy, not only here, but on other countries. And the possibility of participating, you know, I don't know if I can go every year to a conference. I can't, you know, to a different country, but then being able to, from my own house, to participate in these discussions has been great. And that happened not only, you know, inside the institutions, but on people participating on other issues too. So that has been good. In the oral history field, we have seen a lot of people working on technology, adjusting technology for the new times. People, you know, working on how to conduct interviews on Zoom. What is the best way to do that? And that opens the, you know, the possibilities of talking to people that is really far away from us, so that we are talking about that. And we are talking also about going back to our collections and reviewing the metadata and reviewing, you know, the descriptions that we have of the oral history that already have there. So I think that has been a good time to slow down and review what we already have and to share with a larger group of practitioners.
Thank you so much, everyone, for that, but especially this last point, Marina, relates directly to a question we have from the audience. And something that I'm particularly concerned about and think about as well. The audience member is asking, as a part of anti-racist educational work, how important is it to revise that metadata and captions on existing materials? And I'd like to frame that question in the context of both archiving and library work traditionally, but also on those projects that are more public facing, things like existing descriptions, right? Both in physical locations and also online. So if you would all care to share your perspective or your experiences in thinking about what it means to do something like decolonizing or your archives or your collections, or approaching your archives and collections with this anti-racist lens and the process of evaluating that. What is the value of spending the time in the pandemic, if you have it, when you can't be public facing, and thinking about that kind of work and organizing that. And from a librarian and also a historian perspective, I have the concern also of not erasing those pasts, right? So for instance, there's a debate about if you're going to update something like a library record, do you keep in the historical record that researchers could ask to see, or that other librarians will see in future, what the previous descriptions were, so that you have a record itself of the very systemic problems that you're trying to overcome? Is it better to maintain records of the changes you're making, right? How do you approach those different issues, and are they important? That's what I'd like to pose to all of you now.
I guess I'll go. Okay. So I think that's a really good question, Elisa. So yes, I think in the archival world, we are looking at description practices. If anyone done it in research, in the Library of Congress, subject headings is a big issue in terms of how and why something is cataloged a particular way and described a certain way. And so there are efforts to petition the Library of Congress to change words and subject headings throughout the last like 20 years or so. By more than that now, 2020, by 30 years to get the better, more language appropriate. And so I think it is important to track these changes. There's a new documentary out called Change the Name that's looking at illegal aliens and how that process to effort and change that subject heading has gone. And so here at the College of Charleston, we have a task force working group right now looking at those kind of criteria around changing, editing, finding aids, subject headings, and metadata for digital records, and what is the criteria and why would we do it, and what kind of quote unquote content trigger warning should we put on collections, and wish we should do it. And I think, it's acknowledging, history, it's acknowledging why something was described. I think it's important to warn or make aware the person encountering those materials that they may encounter some language they're not used to seeing in print anymore. I do think archive libraries should document their experiences and why they change things that they're doing. Because usually in a finding aid, you do know if an edit has been made to a finding aid. Now, historically, those necessarily haven't denoted like what was changed, but I could see, like you said, the value of denoting what has been changed in a finding aid. Currently at Avery, we have a project to digitize some Black women's collections through DPLA through funding to Pivotal Ventures. And as a result, we're able to digitize some audiovisual and collections relating to Black women, as well as change, edit some metadata on LCDL. And so working with Leah on those efforts.
I think I'll just, because you're talking about LCDL, I was just thinking in terms of anti-racism. A lot of times what I have found is that it's not just offensive language that you're looking for, but it's also just missing people and missing topics that are just not there, because because of how we kind of, how the default works in terms of associating the importance of objects, the importance of historical narratives. And it goes back to, a plantation journal that really might, you can write the metadata for that just with the name of the person who wrote it, and not acknowledge the several hundred other names that are in there. And but really, when you look at the book, it's about what enslaved laborers were doing. It's about them. It's not about the white guy who wrote the book. He just happened to be the one who wrote it all down. So in terms of the historical value of that object, I think a lot of this is just taking a fresh look at what you have and seeing if there's really more people involved and more narratives involved than you previously understood or someone else previously understood it to have. And then going back and filling in those blanks, and sometimes going so far as to reorienting. And this, maybe not with metadata, but this certainly is true with digital exhibits, is constantly, because we have the Lowcountry Digital Library or Digital History Initiative for exhibits. It has people can come because they want to write about the Lowcountry or because they want to write about underrepresented narratives. And if they come because they want to write about a Lowcountry narrative, a lot of times it's just me continuing to work with them about how do you continue to center underrepresented voices in that narrative. You can still write that narrative, but you have to oftentimes remind people how to do that. So it's just this constant check on yourself and with your team and with, graduate students or undergraduate students, whoever you're working with, to make sure you're still kind of mission centered. I might have gone slightly off topic, but that's.
I don't think so. I think that's right on. And Marita, did you have something to add?
Yes, I wanted to add that in the Charleston community, the archivists in Charleston are taking very seriously this. That CALM, the organization that where the archivists and librarians are working together in Charleston. We are working on the antiracism, initiative, and we are having all these discussions, and that that is such a powerful, generous community that is working to move the needle in Charleston, and then I think that at the same time that we have to work on improving our records, I think that we need to work more on connecting with the people that need the records. So how my question is how we connect better with the communities that can benefit from from the materials that we have in our archives, and how one thing that we do, and we do on our metadata, and we do in our exhibitions, is that we do everything bilingual. And I have to, all our descriptions are written in Spanish and in English, and I have to, to say thank you to our partners from the Lowcountry Digital Library to walk the extra mile with us. And I think that that is part of, being assertive, and just to make sure that the things that you are collecting are useful for the community that gives you with those materials. And yeah, that's it.
Well, I think I just to build on sort of what Marina and Leah are talking about in terms of these, the extra mile, or, with underrepresented history work, I know when we're working with projects, we often have to be very clear about, like, this takes collaboration and it takes a lot of work and time, that it can't just be a fast, I have an idea, let's knock it out, let's go get that off the history tree and stick it up, on the wall, or stick it on the website. That in fact, when you're dealing with underrepresented histories and voices and topics and audiences that you want to reach, you have to prioritize that, and have to really be proactive about going for that in your, whether it's in your collaborative groups that you work with, your advisory groups, whether it's scholars, community stakeholders, whoever you're working with, that you put in that time to really listen and invest, in your grant writing and your audience outreach, that it's a targeted goal. And I think that's something that even in my own office, when we're planning projects, I have to say, no, this project's going to need time. So when we make a schedule, put in time, as well as think about the resources to make that happen, and it will be worth it. And it will make your institution stronger. But it is something you have to think of as real work, and as real benefit. But it's something that can't just happen fast. So going back to the digital planning time we have now, use that time. but it is really powerful to focus and prioritize on.
I just want to remind our audience that if you have a comment or a question that you would like to raise to the panelists, you may place it in the chat, and we will do that. We have another question, two questions that I think are related and directly relevant to what we've been talking about, coming from the audience. And the first is, how would you handle collecting in a cultural community when part of the community is open to having this history collected and shared and another part is not? And I think that could be particularly relevant to several of the work that you all are doing. And also this idea of explaining a bit more, and this came out of something that you had said earlier, Aisha, about the right to be forgotten, which I think is also related to this question. And I think that the way I would like to frame that is through the lens of, I know, archivists as activists, that sort of idea of expanding the record. Can you do, by building the archives, by working with communities, are you changing the record itself? And how that works in your own experiences, and how that relates to the collecting of the now, right? And where are the boundaries there, and how can people work to push them, right? To push the boundaries. And are there boundaries that should not be pushed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the right not to be forgotten, when I first heard about it, it was in the case of in the UK, the United Kingdom, around privacy and around websites, and right, if you go search your name, something comes up, you don't want it listed, what does that mean? Can you get it removed? And that was kind of the first kind of thought that I had heard about right to be forgotten. And as we move forward in an archive world, I think it comes to a point where archivists are always like collecting everything, right? And we have to realize that we have limitations in terms of storage, in terms of personnel and money, all that. And so we have to be comfortable with knowing that we can only preserve and get so much. On the donor side, though, the donors have right to say no to an archive. That's their right, like they don't have to preserve, even if it's someone like Toni Morrison or something, she did donate her papers to the Princeton. And I think that there is if she didn't want to donate her papers, that's her right, I mean, that, and although we would love her writings, we don't own her. We don't own her papers. She owns them. And so I think that is kind of the conversation that we have to have as, as researchers, as archivists, as cultural heritage people, is that, who owns what and what kind of right, quote unquote, do we have to things. The other part of the question about working with communities, it is tough with communities, when, especially if you're working with Native American community, Indigenous communities. There are specific rules, regulations when you're working with tribal nations. And so you want to definitely, if you're working with that community, to really be respectful of traditions, of hierarchy, because but I do think if there are people that are willing to talk with you, and you have to build that trust, right? And it's really a long term, that Mary was saying, like you can't expect it to happen overnight. And so the longer you stay in the community, you help them, you attend their town halls, you attend their events, that that shows you're invested in the community, and that you're not just coming in and taking materials and putting it somewhere they can't get access to. Other kind of concerns that donors may have is you put restrictions on things, and that can make them feel more comfortable with preserving their collections outside of their community, because they may want to only certain people have access to certain things because of traditions, because of knowledge sharing and all of that. So I think those are kind of the two ways to get into and out of communities. So we can definitely talk about more, and I've definitely ready to talk more about with that person. Just email me. I'd love to talk with you more.
Marina, would you want to share perhaps some of your experiences in doing this kind of work in oral history? Because that is, that's a very specific way of both talking about the past, but also collecting the now that I think is relevant.
Yeah, and that is a question that always is in our mind, that a good idea doesn't need necessarily need to come alive. That you try sometimes to interview people, but they always have the right to say no. That talking with somebody is not the same that having your story recorded. And as Aisha said, that that you need to build trust with the people that you want to interview, and it's particularly important on this time. And we have an issue with the immigrants, and I know that it's the same thing with the activists in the past years with the Black Lives Matter activists, that about names and about protecting people identities and how you document people participating on demonstrations. So that is an issue that we have to wrestle with, that because we want to document, but then you don't want to put anybody on risk. And we really don't have on the archives the protection to, we don't have the protection. We cannot avoid somebody going to jail because somebody look on our records and find people information. So I think that we have to be very cognizant of that our interest in an issue is not, doesn't supersede the safety of the people that is risking their life on the streets. So we do as much as we can to protect people's identity. We share with our interviewees the risks. And again, it's the tension. We want to share everything online, and we want to make this information available. And we are looking at that again and thinking that maybe something doesn't need to be online. So that the Lowcountry Digital Library is a great source for us. You can just Google a name with oral history, and the oral history is going to pop up first in Google. So it's very easy to find the oral history interview of a person in our collection. So that means that your story, the story of violence, trauma, any history could be available for potential partner, a potential employer, a potential, for anybody to see. So that is something that we really need to be very careful when we are approaching our work, because the first thing that we don't want to do is to hurt anybody. So there is a lot, that's another conversation that I have seen. Aisha, probably you know much more than I about this, but I have seen much more conversations about letting each community to anchor their own narratives and letting people decide what they want to collect and what they want to tell, instead of going, with this, going into the community and saying, oh, your story is very, it's very important. Yes, we know. So that it is a good time to step down a little bit and let people decide what they want to preserve and what they don't want. But issues of identity and photography and video and what you put on the internet, those are things that we really need to be very, very careful on those times.
And I just wanted to add to what Marina is saying about oral histories being a specific kind of case. They're the with the Lowcountry Digital Library, and even with them being in Las Fochas de Lowcountry, the digital exhibit for LDHI, you know, being protective of the people whose stories you're telling is important, and also being willing to say, okay, you decided you wanted to share, but then you decided you didn't want to share. And that's okay too. You know, with LCDL, we have a takedown policy, and it, you know, we're as my wise, the wise director of LCDL says, we're not in the business of having information up or oral histories up that people don't want up. And you know, oral histories are a funny thing because they're so personal, deeply personal. They end up just being very, very interesting sources of people revealing themselves in ways that you wouldn't have if you just got their papers. So I think those are such a particular case too, and making sure all of the people you're partnering with on that project are on the same page about how sensitive you're going to be to the willingness or not willingness to share those stories.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that.
Sorry.
Oh, well, it's real quick. I was just going to add that I do remember a time when I was working at the College of Charleston when someone asked to have their oral history taken down, and part of it was they had done the oral history like in the 90s and didn't know that the internet was going to happen, that this was going to be a thing where someone can Google you and find you like that. So it was something that seemed fine for an archival repository where a researcher is on site, you know, listening to it. It became a whole nother ballgame when it was suddenly available online in that way. And so I think it's something to be conscientious of older oral histories as well that are digitized, as well as current ones, of being very clear about, you know, what this could mean and being willing to take it down if someone's just not up for being out there to the world, you know. But sorry, go ahead, Maria.
I want to add that because we are local, that, you know, at the same time that we want to have better collections and we want to have better materials, we want to deepen the relationship with the community that we live and we share space and we share this time, so that sometimes you have to sacrifice your collection to keep the relationship. And any day I will take to keep the relationship instead of keeping a piece of the collection. So that, you know, that has to be, for me, you know, that the anchor of my practice is how we keep relationships and how we keep moving together, you know, to make this city, this place, a better place for everybody.
Yeah, I just want to add, recently I do teach a little bit of community archiving to people. Anyways, I recently came across an article that talked about the purpose of community archives, and if a community wants to keep their records versus donating to an archive, a normal traditional archive, mainstream archive. And the article basically said, I'll find it, I'll send it to Rachel, she sent it out. Basically it was like, the purpose of a community archive necessarily doesn't have to be about the records, about challenging the narrative of the mainstream story. And so if a community can preserve and record their histories, is not just about that record, but it's about the long narrative of that region, of that state, of that city, to insert their history. That's why Avery was so important. Given it established 1990, there was really no one in Charleston talking about Black Charleston, Black history in Charleston. And so having a space like Avery research center to be a community space, to be a research center around Black history, Black people, it's just so special. And so I just want to say thank you to the Averites. Not have anyone on, but thank you for putting this space together. And I know that the staff at Avery we hold it together well, and we thank you so much.
Yes, that's wonderful. And I want to share another question from the audience that is related to these issues of respecting the communities that you're serving, or that you're archiving, or the people that you're trying to represent through the work that you're doing. And the audience member is asking if you've all had to deal with the issue of anti-racist material being potentially re-traumatizing to underrepresented audience members, and how you may have handled this violent or racist material in ways that are sensitive to trauma when interfacing with the public. Does anyone have any experience with that or thoughts about it?
I know this does come up a lot with museum planning and, considering ways to both, be honest about, traumatic histories that have taken place without needing to re-traumatize a visitor. So I think, one strategy is just a warning sign, that certain content has a warning sign for visitors to see before they enter a space, that they'll know, here's what's in this space, and you can choose for yourself whether or not you want to engage violent imagery or offensive imagery of certain kinds, because it does help to understand what happened. I think at the same time, you also have curators who are interested in making choices about creative ways to understand the history of trauma without necessarily needing to recreate. So I think sometimes we'll have clients that their mind immediately goes to, like, let's do virtual reality of this terrible thing. And it's like, no, there are other ways that you can evoke a historic experience. Sometimes it's through more of an immersive media program that's more like a soundscape, or even just having quiet spaces within the building to contemplate, history or historic information, so that people have a quiet space to think about it. And I think even literature or music or creative works can help evoke understanding without this tendency to need to recreate the traumatic experience. But, I think it's something my firm actually does. Their claim to fame is they were developed the U.S. Holocaust Museum in DC, which was, does deal with very traumatic history. And I know they sort of chose a range of strategies to engage that story that made it a very powerful experience. But it's an ongoing challenge with each museum project. We have to sort of talk to the client and talk to the curators, and also talk to scholarly and community advisors and different folks to have their input on how they feel about how certain histories are addressed. So it's not just, it's a collective decision, what the institution does choose to do.
I want to say that that sometimes for us, the question is the other way around too. How to present the humanity of a community, moving beyond the victim definition. So, because for many people in the moving community or the immigrant community, you are justified if you are a victim, if you have been suffering, if you have a terrible life, and that is the way to justify your life, to say, okay, you are here because you have this terrible past. And if you don't have that, you cannot justify your presence in this community. So I think that for us, somehow the challenge is to say that our humanity doesn't depend only on the pain, right? That is just, and I think that is what Black Lives Matter is saying too, that we need to be seen beyond the status of victim, beyond the status. So I think that I never had this issue with somebody challenging something that is too traumatic, but I think that we have the issue about representing our community beyond these so narrow lenses that we use to define a full community. Yeah.
Thank you, Marina. That was great, because I talk with other people about, civil rights museums, and people don't want to come to them or go to them. They're like, oh, that's a story I already know, that struggle. What I love so much about the Smithsonian Namak Museum, it does do both really well. It talks about the struggle, the tragedies, but even in these moments of tragedy, talk about the joy, about family, about retentions, about survival, but then also resilience. And so I think that, plays really well with each other. And then when we haven't been, I know it's just a pandemic, but oh God. But if you can get there, I really encourage you to go, because the top floors about the life and culture, entertainment. And then you think about, like, these things are happening at the same time, and how do you have a Mom's Mabley, and then you have Jim Crow, and so it's just interesting. And how do entertainers and movies put together lives and joy. And I think we talk about archives, about Charleston, at Avery, talk about education. We have our exhibit about Avery as a school. And then through our exhibits, we have stuff about like Flipper Simmons and his work, and how that has been revered and honored nationally, internationally. And then in our exhibits on the third floor, which is rotating, we recently had an exhibit about the Zetas, which is the part of Divine Nine. And so I think having all of these conversations with each other, narrative conversation, gives a fuller experience of communities, and that is part of the anti-racist approach, because it's not just bogging down and quote unquote the struggle, but showing how through the struggle life goes on. That's also part of an exhibit that Mary Jo Fairchild and I worked on about Reconstruction era, and how even in Reconstruction you can put the lens of survival and resilience through the creation of churches, creation of libraries and schools, and these families that through voting and politics came through. And so just this interesting how to interpret history, as Leah and Mary had indicated earlier.
I just wanted to quickly add, I think in storytelling, right, if you, even when you watch a movie or you read a book that involves traumatic experiences for a character, that isn't the whole story. So I think making sure that you're telling the whole story, and that if you're centering trauma, you need to understand why you're doing that, and think about whether or not that is the right thing to center in, with that object, with that individual, with that narrative, whatever it is. Because oftentimes, for example, there's going to be an exhibit about enslaved women in the Lowcountry. That certainly involves violence and sexual violence, because that's part of that narrative. But there is all of these women's experiences are so varied and so vast, and they're so interesting, and they all contribute and function so differently. Just telling their many different stories, while trauma appears in that narrative, it certainly isn't central to. And I also think, like, thinking about how people see themselves can help determine where trauma fits into a narrative as well. But the whole story of someone or someplace helps to kind of fit trauma in where it should be.
Thank you all for that really thoughtful response to a difficult question. Before we conclude our time, I really want to come back to the challenges that everyone is facing in this pandemic and the sort of uncertainties of knowing how long that will last, but also the realization that many of the things we've developed during the pandemic because we had to are things that maybe we should have already been doing. And maybe there are ways of using the digital to reach communities, to reach audiences, to create community that doesn't require that everyone has to be in the same place at the same time, but can still have those experiences to share is not a bad thing, right? But there are some ways that this is useful. And so I have some questions here. The first is, how can you engage communities and sort of continue this work of engagement during the restrictions we face in the pandemic? And are there digital tools as an answer to help with answer this question? And also related to that, what are some open source digital programs or platforms that you all might recommend from your own experiences, for instance, that participants might be able to use themselves or find as a way in to thinking about how to make some of this work manageable during this time, because a lot of people feel the need to do something digitally, but a lot of people face funding restrictions and or training problems in order to be able to do so.
I don't mind starting with this one. Since we were digital before and continue to be digital now, I think that making sure your system is sustainable, whatever you decide to do, think about whether or not you can continue to maintain it. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to put an exhibit up on WordPress, who is going to continue to maintain it? This goes back to that planning conversation, right? But there's, Omeka is free and open source. WordPress, there's, and Omeka can be used. I think Omeka S is actually also, there's a free version of it, I think. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's more geared towards collections, with Omeka being more flexible towards exhibits. But in talking about planning, while we were already on Google Drive as a team, and using that successfully, I also began using Trello as a team organizing app that has worked really successfully with working with students and making sure everybody kind of knows what they're doing. It's also free. I use Slack for communication as well. So I think part of what I have found with going from an in-person office to at home where everybody is working with me is having very, very clear modes of information sharing. How are we going to communicate as a team? When are we going to communicate as a team? And what are the expectations about how those forms of communication will be used? Because if you set up Trello and no one uses it, and you just accidentally revert back to email and your email blows up and becomes chaotic, then it doesn't work. But if you kind of, no, we gotta go see your Trello, check it out. There's really work there. It works really well, and people will kind of transition, and then making sure that, you kind of pick whatever mode you're gonna work in and stick with it. So that again goes back to planning. LDHI has managed to stick with Omeka all these years, but that also takes some upkeep. So, there's small grants out there that can help with some of that maintenance, but it's certainly something to consider in terms of which platform you choose.
I was just going to add, I don't know the magic answer for which app is going to do this or which program, but I know a lot of the clients that we work with are asking about, how are we going to reopen? And for so long, design was all about getting interactives in there, getting visitor participation in there, and, touching stuff. This is a problem now, right? That with reopening, it's going to be a while, and, maybe for the foreseeable future. So I know that technology, a lot of people are really working on ways to safely enter a museum again and be able to explore these cool digital tools that are often part of museum's website, but also part of, what's in the building when you go to a museum. And so I know the thing one of my supervisors says is, we spent forever trying to get people off their phones when we went to museums, and now we want to get them on their phones, because they basically want, that you can use that to help you, learn something further about an artifact beyond what's on the tiny label with 25 words or something. And so it's a way to open up more what's going on, or can open up, an audio program that you could be listening to connected to an oral history, connected to an artifact. So it's a way to expand what can happen in the building without having to touch anything or touch something you're already touching. So I know that that's sort of where a lot of the museum design planning is going, of, how to safely reopen, and thinking what you can do with a phone. Or obviously not everyone's going to have these devices, so how museums could plan for having devices that can be checked out and safely sanitized moving forward. But and also, honestly, they're coming up with all kinds of cool stuff that you can like hold your finger over something and it's like you press the button, but you don't actually have to touch it, So I think basically keep an eye out for what's coming technology wise for, a safer world as the world opens. But I know the iPhone has been a go-to for figuring that out with my own firm. We'll see what the cool free app is that comes out of that. Somebody will make it.
Yeah, I think the pandemic, through Avery, we've started in the spring our Avery Digital Classroom, and we are continuing that in the fall. Actually, we have an event tonight at 6 o'clock. You can join us there. And so I think the programming aspect, which is what a lot of our community building comes from Avery, is sorely missed from that perspective, and people really do love that. So moving into a virtual environment was great, and that's something I think we will continue to do once we do reopen, because people who cannot, get to Avery because of disabilities or health, whatever, also widens our exposure to other people, other audiences. For the archives perspective, we are doing consultations virtually online, and we're also doing instruction sessions with students virtually. And I think that is, you can able to record, you can do more recording of videos and highlight specific collections or that they may not have ever thought about using before. And then another cool thought. Oh, well, Rachel and I are working on through this, for studying slavery in Charleston. They had the Curate Escape website that will be
Oh no, Aisha has frozen.
maps.
Okay.
By what?
Sorry, you froze for just a moment, that's all.
Oh no, okay. So
Ended with Curatescape.
Curatescape. Okay, so using Curatescape as a platform to highlight sites, maybe extant or still standing. So as a way to get people in the community and showing spaces that on the living landscape where people have lived and continue to live. And I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of those suggestions and examples. I think that one of the things that really strikes me about this whole process of moving to the digital and reasons for keeping some of it is the issue of access and making things more accessible to everyone. And Marina, I was going to ask you if you had something to say about that, and it looks like you might.
No, I don't want to be the Grinch to finish this. I just feel overwhelmed with all this programming, and I am just tired of all of this. So I don't want to be the Grinch. So now we are really focusing on, on the technology side and how to be ready to the new developments, but also being, thinking about the community that we want to connect with. That on one side we have all these beautiful developments, and on the other side we have a big portion of our population that cannot access to the internet. So what are the limitations of our work with the communities that we want to access when we have kids parking on church, on church parking lots to connect to the internet to do homework. So I think those are the limitations of the our communities, and I think that we are sharing things that we think that are relevant, that are important, but I don't want to create more things and more things just because we need to do something. So I think that we need to have some, to give permission to ourselves to sometimes don't do everything. We are changing the way that we do our conferences. We are changing the way that we connect to each other, but we don't need to be doing programmings every day or every week just because we have to run and do something. So, but please say something else, because I don't want to be the Grinch here.
I think that your point is very well taken, that there's opportunity with the digital, but it also reveals the great vast divide between people who have access to the digital and those who don't. And that perhaps anti-racist work in our institutions also has something to do with trying to help make that divide smaller in our communities, and that's actually a part of that process, and that's something worth talking about and discussing as we move forward in Charleston and together. And I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. I'm so thrilled to have joined this community, and I hope that we can have more conversations and that we can engage more with the community and with people who are trying to do this work in interesting ways that are not overwhelming, but hopefully helpful. Rachel, did you want to take us out?
Well, thank you. I just, as I guess as the chair, just to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank our panelists. You all provided a tremendous amount of information, and I tried to, if you could check in the chat if you haven't seen already, tried to put up links to as many things that were mentioned as possible. Feel free to email me if you would like any more. Yeah, that's really so. Thanks to everyone, and thanks everyone for coming. Thanks. And with that,
thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
long.
It's great.